Organizations looking at using Microsoft Azure might also consider migrating some of their existing solutions to the cloud, as opposed to solely using new configurations in the cloud. So this would include any on-premises IT systems that might be suitable to run in Azure. This could be a physical server that would be converted to a virtual machine that might run in Azure, or it could already be an existing virtual machine running on premises, whether it's based on Hyper-V or VMware. It might also include a database system, a custom line of business app. Any of those types of things can potentially be moved into the Azure cloud with little to no changes, or if there are too many changes required, we might have to refactor or rebuild the entire solution in the cloud, if that is feasible. Now, other than IT systems, we might also consider migrating on-premises data into the cloud. So we'll talk about a couple of ways to do that, whether we're talking about a little bit of data that can be migrated over the internet or large volumes of data that might require some other type of solution. So when migrating to the cloud, the first thing to think about is, do we have an equivalent functional solution in the cloud that maps to what we're currently doing on premises with a given system? Can we map something we're doing into the cloud? An example of this would be the fact that we might be running a backend database on premises for a web app that might be running on MySQL. And we do have a way to migrate that directly into the Microsoft Azure cloud to run the MySQL database solution as a managed service. We then have to think about security standards that need to be adhered to. So we might already be compliant with security standards on premises, but we have to make sure that Microsoft Azure supports that as a target, and our use of Azure services will also remain compliant. And in the case of migration, during the migration, if that is occurring over the internet, we have to make sure, again, that we still remain compliant with any security standards. That might necessitate the need to set up a VPN site-to-site tunnel between your on-premises network and an Azure VNet to ensure security of any data being migrated into the Azure cloud. We then have to consider our workload requirements. For example, how many virtual CPUs will be required in the cloud? How much RAM will be required? Generally speaking, the cloud is much more flexible when it comes to vertical scaling for horsepower of virtual machines than we might otherwise be able to do on premises. The great thing, too, is that when we run Azure migration assessments of on-premises servers, it will detect the amount of compute power, the amount of RAM that is required in the cloud, and make recommendations for virtual machine sizing in Azure. When you're thinking about migrating to the cloud, you need to understand the term lift and shift migration. This really refers to the ability to migrating an on-premises solution to the cloud with either little or no change at all, because we can map it to a service offering from the cloud service provider that will accommodate the workload and its data currently running on premises. The Azure Migrate service is available, and it allows us to discover and also perform a migration assessment of on-premises IT workloads. So it'll detect any on-premises IT systems, whether they're physical servers, whether they are virtual machines, database servers, and also any dependencies that it might have on other components. A proper migration assessment might also require you to have detailed knowledge of the data flow of an application, especially if it's a customized app. For example, on premises, there might be a dependency on user authentication through Microsoft Active Directory, in which case you would have to either recreate those user accounts in Azure AD, or you might actually configure a link between Azure AD and your on-premises AD, so users can continue to use their same credentials to access cloud-based apps. The great thing about the Azure Migrate service also is it also can provide cost estimates based on what it's detected and mapped to an equivalent solution in the Azure cloud. Azure Migrate Service Discovery can discover virtual machines, whether they're running on Hyper-V or VMware, virtual desktop infrastructure or VDI solutions for user virtual desktops, databases, It can also detect web applications, and also you can determine how you're going to migrate your on-premises data into the cloud. For large amounts of data, you might consider using Azure Data Box, especially if you're talking about terabytes of data in an on-premises data center that you need to get into the Azure cloud. So you can actually have an Azure Data Box device, which is a physical appliance, sent to your location, where you can then connect to the web interface to configure it to gather the data and then send it back to Azure to be imported into Azure. You can actually use DataBox also to get data, large volumes of data, out of Microsoft Azure if you want to bring that data back on premises, or if you decide you want to put it in with another cloud provider. So the first step in using the Azure Migration Service is to create a project. And this is all done through the Azure portal. Next, you have to deal with how you're going to work with your on-premises collector virtual machine. You can download a Hyper-V or VMware collector VM. You could even run a physical server as an on-prem collector VM that will gather data that's then sent to the Azure project in the cloud. From there, you can organize your discovered virtual machines into groups. And finally, you can view or even download the resultant assessments, which can take a bit of time based on the data sent into Azure to the project from the on-premises collector VM. And from there, you can determine suitability for actually migrating services into Azure.